In the square in front of Buckingham Palace, a crowd of tourists gathers to watch the familiar changing of the guard. But one of them, cocky and bold, decides to put on a show, mocking the Royal Guard's march. He laughs, feeding off the crowd's reaction, convinced it's just harmless fun. But what happened next turned everything upside down. London gleamed in the morning light, its historic streets filling with tourists flocking toward Buckingham Palace. A crowd had gathered in front of the black iron gates that separated the royal residence from the everyday sightseers who had come to witness one of Britain's most famous traditions, the changing of the guard. A soldier in a bright red uniform and a towering bearskin hat moved with perfect posture, each step measured with strict precision. This was more than just a spectacle. It was a centuries-old tradition, and everyone present seemed to understand that, except for one person. Brian. Tall, tanned, and sporting a London tour t-shirt. This wasn't his first time here. In fact, he prided himself on being an experienced traveler, someone who didn't just observe landmarks, but turned them into content. Why just watch when you could entertain a crowd and rack up likes? "Dude, they seriously move like robots," he snickered, elbowing his friend Zach. Zach chuckled but stayed quiet. He was here to soak in the atmosphere, not to cause a scene. Brian's girlfriend, Kate, was already starting to feel uneasy. She recognized that look in his eyes. He was up to something. And then it began. "Copying their march. Let's go." With a wide grin, Brian took his first step, perfectly in sync with the guard's movement. Then another. Knees lifting high, arms swinging forward, he exaggerated every motion, turning the rigid formality of the soldier's march into a cartoonish act. The crowd noticed. Some chuckled, some pulled out their phones, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Brian felt it, that intoxicating attention he craved. It always worked. A little harmless fun, a little defiance, and suddenly, he was the center of it all. "Brian, stop it," Kate hissed, grabbing his sleeve. But he just laughed. "Come on, it's just a show. They can't do anything anyway." The crowd began to split into two camps, those egging him on and those glaring with disapproval. Someone scoffed loudly. "Is he seriously mocking the Royal Guard?" But Brian was in his element. He was the star of the moment, and he wasn't stopping. What if I walk right in front of him? Brian took a few steps closer to the guard, still mimicking his exaggerated march. His movements became even more ridiculous, his arms flailing like he was performing in a cheap theater act. The crowd started to shift. "Brian, seriously, enough!" Kate's voice carried an edge of real concern now. She could feel the energy shifting. But he wasn't listening. His entire focus was on himself. What he didn't notice, what he failed to see, was the guard's stance changing. He didn't see the way the soldier's posture grew, just a fraction stiffer. He didn't notice the guard's hand tightening around his rifle. The crowd noticed. The laughter began to die down. No one knew what would happen next. But everyone could feel it. This was the moment the joke stopped being funny. The crowd watched Brian with growing tension. Those who had laughed moments ago were now quiet, uneasy. Some were still recording, but no longer for amusement. Now it was because they sensed something unexpected was about to unfold. Brian took another step closer. His mocking movements were no longer playful. They were taunting. He was basking in the attention, relishing the control he thought he had over the moment. But he didn't see what was changing around him. The guard he was imitating suddenly stopped. His boots froze in place, his entire body locked into a rigid stance. He was no longer just part of a silent tradition. Now his stillness carried a warning. Something inside Brian tensed, but he refused to let it show. He still thought he was in control, that he could push the moment even further. But for the first time, his confidence wavered. The crowd held its breath. Some took a step back, sensing that the light-hearted prank was about to spiral into something completely different. Silence swallowed the square, devouring the laughter and chatter that had filled it moments before. Just a minute ago, Brian had felt like the star of the show, the comedian, the center of attention. But now, that moment had lost its lightness. The atmosphere had changed, thick with tension. The crowd held its breath. Those who had cheered Brian on with laughs and grins now looked different. Some quickly lowered their phones, realizing this wasn't funny anymore. Others, on the contrary, kept recording, sensing they were about to capture a rare moment, something that could go viral. But for Brian, the world had suddenly shrunk. The confidence that had fueled him seconds ago had started to waver. In front of him stood the guard, tall, rigid, as if carved from stone. His posture was perfect, just as expected of a soldier serving in the royal guard. But now, in his stillness, there was something unsettling. Brian had laughed before, calling the guards living statues. Now he realized how wrong he'd been. The guard moved. It was just one step, precise, firm, calculated to the millimeter. But that step changed everything. The crowd instinctively recoiled. Someone exhaled sharply. A hushed whisper broke the silence. "Whoa." The guard didn't speak. He didn't need to. His movement was his answer. Brian felt his muscles tense on their own. He realized he had taken a step back without meaning to, nearly stumbling in the process. But the worst part wasn't the movement. It was the guard's eyes. Cold, indifferent, unwavering. It wasn't anger or irritation. It wasn't even disdain. It was nothing. And that was far more terrifying. Beside him, Kate stood frozen. Her face was tense, lips slightly parted, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare to. She no longer pulled at Brian's sleeve. Now, she just watched. The guard didn't look away. He had seen people like Brian before, tourists who thought they could push the limits without consequences. But the guard had a job to do, and he executed it flawlessly. Brian felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear in the way he knew it. It was pressure, like the air had grown heavier, like the weight of his own body had doubled. The world around him no longer felt as friendly. He wanted to take another step back, but he knew that if he did, if he retreated again, it would be over. But it already was. The crowd was watching. There was no admiration in their eyes anymore, only expectation. They were waiting to see what would happen to him. The guard took another step forward. It was mechanical, flawless, like a perfectly trained movement from an unshakable force. Brian understood. One more step, and there would be no distance left between them. He had only one choice. He stepped back. The crowd saw it. He lost. Brian's step backward shattered what remained of his confidence. Just moments ago, he had controlled the crowd's attention, made them laugh, drawn them in. But now, everything had shifted. He was no longer the main act. Now the stage belonged to the guard. The guard stood firm, motionless once again. But his silence was no longer empty. It was absolute. It was a force. And it was more intimidating than words could ever be. The crowd had seen Brian's moment of defeat. A whisper passed through them. He actually backed off. Others simply watched, breathless. Even those who had laughed at first were silent now. They understood. This wasn't a game anymore. And then, the guard spoke. "Make way for the guard." His voice tore through the air like a crack of thunder. It wasn't just loud, it was commanding. People flinched. Even those far from the scene instinctively stepped back. These weren't just words. This was an order. The guard raised his rifle, gripping it firmly with both hands. He wasn't aiming. He wasn't threatening. But the message was clear. This wasn't just a soldier in a fancy uniform. This was a soldier. Brian felt the blood drain from his face. And finally, it hit him. He hadn't just made a joke. He hadn't just played around with a tradition. He had crossed a line. He tried to straighten up, to regain his posture, to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. The guard didn't move. He didn't break eye contact. He was waiting for Brian to finally understand. And the crowd saw the moment when he did. Kate looked away. She didn't want to watch Brian's transformation, from a cocky prankster to a public embarrassment. Brian couldn't stand still anymore. His body moved on its own. One more step back, then another. The crowd whispered again. Someone caught it all on camera. He could already see the headlines. Tomorrow he wouldn't be a viral sensation. He'd be an example, the tourist who got put in his place. The guard stood motionless once more. His job was done. Discipline had spoken. Brian knew there was nothing left for him here, so he turned and walked away, feeling the weight of hundreds of silent eyes on his back. There was no laughter now. Brian walked away from the square, feeling as if a massive weight had settled on his shoulders. The crowd no longer laughed, but they didn't leave either. They watched him leave, like a defeated fighter staggering away after a knockout. Each step echoed dully in his mind. He could feel it, phones recording him, capturing every second of his retreat. He knew that by tomorrow his humiliation would be everywhere. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the emptiness. He had always thrived on attention, always known how to keep a crowd engaged. He could turn any moment into a show. But now he wasn't at the center. He was on the outside. He had lost control. Kate walked beside him in silence, not even glancing his way. That, more than anything, told him everything he needed to know. She had always backed him up, even when she thought he was being reckless. But now she didn't even try to defend him. Whispers followed him as he walked. People pointed. Others just stared at his back, watching the tourist who went too far. The story of the day. He dared to glance at Kate, hoping she would say something, anything. But she just kept walking. So, he looked at his phone instead. The first notifications were already rolling in. "Did you see that idiot tourist embarrassing himself? How can someone be this dumb? Did he seriously think the guards were just actors?" The videos were already spreading, and this was only the beginning. One thought pounded in his head over and over. How did I let this happen? This wasn't just a mistake. This was a fall. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. Brian sat in his hotel room, staring at the screen of his phone. The glow from the display reflected off his face, but his eyes were empty, unfocused. Blurred comments, hundreds of notifications, an endless flood of mockery, judgment, and heated debates. He swiped them away, as if that could erase his mistake. But the effect was the opposite. The more he tried to push it from his mind, the stronger the memories came rushing back in vivid flashes. How he had marched, mimicking the guards, how the crowd had laughed, cheering him on, how the guard had stopped, and everything changed. How his own body instinctively took a step back when it stopped being funny. How he realized he had lost control. How he felt, in that single moment, that the moment no longer belonged to him. He had crossed the line, and now he was dealing with the consequences. Public humiliation. He tapped on one of the viral videos. His own face appeared on the screen. But it didn't feel like him. The Brian in that video still believed he was in control, that he was putting on a show. But the Brian sitting in this room now barely recognized him. He skipped forward, letting the video play at double speed. And then, the moment. The guard took that first step forward, The crowd went silent. Brian, standing there, still grinning at first, flinched. Then he stepped back. Watching himself from the outside made it feel even worse. The comments were brutally clear. "There it is. Internet tough guy folded like a chair. Dude really thought he was the main character. The moment he realized, he fucked up. You lost." The words echoed louder in his head than any comment on the screen. He tried to reason with himself. It's just a video. In a week, no one will care. But he knew that was a lie. Kate didn't look at him. On the edge of the bed, Kate sat quietly, holding a glass of water. She barely sipped it. She didn't scold him. She didn't make a sharp remark. She didn't even sigh in frustration. She just sat there in silence. And that silence hit harder than any words could. Before, whenever Brian did something crazy, she'd laugh along with him. Sure, sometimes she'd call him reckless, but he could always convince her it was just harmless fun. But now she wasn't even looking at him. And that was the worst part. Finally, after what felt like forever, she broke the silence. "Do you understand why this was wrong?" Her voice was quiet, but there was exhaustion in it. Brian nodded slowly. He understood. Not because the crowd shamed him, not because the video went viral. Because, for the first time, he realized none of that mattered. The problem wasn't the internet. The problem wasn't even the guard. The problem was him. He had spent so much time treating the world like a stage, seeing people as an audience for his content. But today, he had hit a wall. There were things in this world bigger than him. Traditions, history, respect. He thought of himself as a jokester, a provocateur, the guy who made everything entertaining. But in front of that guard, he was just another person who forgot his place. This was a lesson he would never forget. Brian didn't say anything else. He simply stood up, walked onto the balcony, and looked out over the evening skyline of London. The city no longer felt as light-hearted and playful as before. Now, for the first time, he saw something more.